All right, I show it's 2 o'clock. Chris, you ready to get started?
Sure. Thanks, Donna. Thanks, everyone, for joining us today for TAA's second webinar on Lease 2.0. During our first webinar, we provided an executive summary and kind of looked at the lease as a whole. For today's webinar, we're going to be taking a closer look at the lease details part of the lease, which is found on page 1, which is probably one of the most significant changes in the lease. We're pleased to have Jerry Carlton with the Dallas law firm of Poulter, Sims, and Martinez. We're also joined today by Brian Swearin with the Swearin law firm in Houston. And of course, Sandy Hoy, our TAA general counsel. I'd also like to thank Corey Rogers for assisting us with the Q&A part of this webinar today. As Donna just sent out during the chat function, we a little while ago sent everybody a copy of the lease as well as a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. This webinar is also being recorded and will be available online for later viewing. So with that, let me turn it over to Sandy and we'll get started.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited for you to be here with us and for us to be able to give you this really quick on-the-go Lease 2.0 training and the anticipated release of our brand new lease coming out in February. This webinar is going to cover what you need to know in filling out the lease, filling out our new Lease 2.0. As Chris said, we're really trying to build on that overview, that introduction webinar that we had last month, and really give you that closer look of page 1 in this lease details box. And we're going to keep it general in nature, not going to talk about legal advice in any specific situation that might arise. And of course, any opinions that are expressed here are those of the presenter and not necessarily those of the apartment association. So with that, let's move to the next slide, and I will talk generally about some timing. As you all know, hopefully you all know, as we've been trying to paper this message throughout our membership, is that the release of this lease will be on February 16th through our TAA Click and Lease system. Before then, you will be able to continue to use the current lease in the system, and up until that date, that lease is going to be in effect and valid. And then on February 16th, it'll switch over to the new lease. If you have any questions about this, please contact communications team at TAA, and I believe their email is I think it's just communications@taa.org, but I will double check with you and with Glenda, and we'll make sure that that's in the chat. Okay, the next slide also has some resources for you to that is, continuing to build on our pre-release education here. We have, since the last webinar we did last month, we've put together a one-pager that is linked there. We also have done some FAQs that have about 20 or so of our top questions that we've received relating to the new lease. Some of them are mechanical, some of them are technological, and some of them are legal in nature. Please pick up that FAQ document and check that out. And then along with the slides that you received today, you also received a sample lease contract. And so that is our 6-page new lease form that we're going to be teaching from today. Like I said, we're going to be highlighting page 1 and the lease details box, but we wanted to give you the whole document so you can see this is the whole thing you got to really look at. That's from 8 pages down to 6. We have made some significant changes like we discussed in the general overview, but we're really excited to push this new lease out and give you this kind of in-depth review of page 1. So with that, we'll move to the next slide. Again, we want to kind of bring you along the way of our education. So we have 3 parts that we have scheduled. The first one was that November webinar that Howard and Corey and I just discussed, the overview and pointing out some of the most popular and most used provisions in the old lease that has been carried over to the new lease, and pointing those out and reviewing those. This section or this presentation is, again, more about the mechanics and how I fill out this new lease, discussing all the blanks on page 1 in the lease detail section. And then part 3 is what we're putting together for January 27th at 10 a.m., where we will be putting it all together. We have the lease document, you know how to fill it out after today, you're comfortable with that. And now we're going to talk about in January using the TAA Community Policies Addendum with the other addenda that are commonly used in the industry. And so these are all recorded, they'll all be available, posted online, but we really hope that you can continue to go along with us and join these free online webinars whenever we have them. So note that, and I also have a note at the end as well, and registration will be coming soon. So be on the lookout for that. Okay, so like I said, today's topic, if we can move to the next slide, today's topic is all about the first page in this new box that is shown on the right side of the page. And this is one of the biggest changes, although the information that you need to fill this out is the same information that you need today to fill out the lease. So that should give you some comfort to know if you know the rent figures and the parties and the who, what, and where, and the how much. That is the same information that you need here. It's just might be slightly reformatted, reorganized, and there might be some new concepts that we have introduced here, and we will go over them in depth very shortly. As you can see, there are plenty of blanks, new blanks, more space for to customize and to delineate different charges that you have that are sort of outside of the rent for the dwelling unit. And again, we'll be discussing that as well. But the overall goal and the reason for putting forth the information like it is on page 1 in this box is so that it's transparent and it's easy to use. It's easy to fill out, it's easy to explain, and you don't have to pick up and flip through 40, 50 pages for you to understand what goes into leasing a unit. You can simply pick up the lease, glance at the first page, and really get an understanding about what it takes and how much it costs and who's involved and the details that you need, of all the important details that you need to understand what goes into the lease and then the lease contract. Before we go to box by box, I wanted to first point out the top of the page 1, which starts out with the title of the document, apartment lease contract, and then it has blanks again for the parties to be listed. And so this is very similar to what you had in the current form, and the advice is going to be the same in that residents are those who are going to be liable to you and for all the lease obligations. And the owner needs to be the owner listed and not the management company. And then those occupants are normally like children or anyone who may not be financially obligated to the lease. And so we have those blanks, and we have those definitions as well that have been all put into paragraph 1. And so the next slide shows those definitions. Paragraph 1 definitions 1.1, 1.2, and 1.3 show the definitions of residents, occupants, and owners. And so those are the definitions that relate to the blanks that you will fill in. That should all be very common to the same practice that you do today. And before we move to, I turn it over to Jerry, I also wanted to just go back to, well, we can go to the next slide actually. And I'm about to turn over to Jerry, and we're going to go box by box. And I wanted to show you though that in each of the boxes, we have a parenthetical that references the corresponding box that has additional provisions relating to the information that you put into that box. So for example, here you see box A and it says apartment. And then that's where you would put in the street address and the apartment number and, you know, the information relating to that specific unit. It says next to apartment, parentheses, paragraph 2, PAR2, paragraph 2. So that is a signal to you that paragraph 2 is where you would go to look at other provisions relating to the information you provided in that box. So we listed paragraph 2 for you right below that box, and where you'll see it says apartment, and it says you are leasing the apartment listed above for use as a private residence only. So the apartment listed above is whatever apartment you list in that box, box A, and then that is the way the lease will work together, is the box with that information that you fill in, plus the corresponding paragraph references, and that is going to be a signal to you and the residents about how you can find the additional provisions relating to that information. So I hope that was clear, and now I will turn it over to Jerry to begin walking through box by box, and then if we have some time at the end of the presentation for the content, then we will take up some questions.
Sandy. And to all, you're probably wondering, if Sandy says this is so easy to do, why do you have 3 lawyers here today on this panel? And I think the purpose is to show you that even your lawyers can fill this form out. So it should be easy for the managers and assistant managers and leasing reps to be able to complete these forms. And we're just here to hold your hand today through the process and guide you with a few comments about the forms that we are completing. And on this box A for apartment, the street address, one tip I do have is that the street address that you should use is the actual street address that the outside world relies upon, especially maybe the Postal Service. I do see a few cases here and there where the constable will not serve the citation or do the writ of possession because the street address that has been put in the petition or in the judgment is different than what they go by in determining where something is addressed. So if you have a property like that, use the street address that's used by the outside world for that premises rather than your own internal system. So as far as this box A goes, it's pretty straightforward what you do. Paragraph 2 there that is below, as Sandy was describing, that's not on page 1. That is in the next page of the lease. So let's move to the next paragraph, next slide. Paragraph box B is the initial lease term, and that's the date that the possession is delivered to the resident or turned over to the resident. And then the ends at 11:59 p.m. is, of course, on the last date of the lease. And pretty straightforward, easy to do. Next box. Okay, paragraph or box C here is a little bit of a change in thinking for you in your method of completing your form. There's a concept in which charges other than base rent are included in rent, in the definition of rent. That's been very common in commercial leases for many, many years. It has not been necessarily clear in the TAA lease that other charges such as utilities and trash collection fees and things like that might be deemed to be a part of rent. But the purpose of the revision in the lease here will be to show that that is part of the intent as described in the paragraph 1.6 that's discussed below. It talks about rent being the monthly base rent plus additional monthly recurring fixed charges. But in this box C, you're putting only your monthly base rent. So if $1,000 is what you're advertising is your base rent, and that's the amount you're going to agree to with your resident, that's the number that goes here into this box. I will point out in paragraph 3 to the side, that's also not on this page 1. but that paragraph 3 and 3.1 are the provisions that relate to the payment due dates and the reference to when or how payments can be made. And specifically, it refers to community policies. And one of the new concepts of this lease is that some provisions that typically might have been in the primary lease form have now been moved to the community policies provision. And to some extent, that's to give you more flexibility and control over how you do things on your property with regard to some of these procedures. And methods and manners and places of making rent payments is one of those things that's been moved. And as we all know, in the last 5 to 10 years, a lot of things have changed in means and methods for paying rent. So this will give you flexibility to adapt to the feature that you are comfortable with using. Next slide. Prorated rent, you're all familiar with that concept. If someone's moving in, let's say on the 15th of the month, then either the first month, some of you charge for a half a month's rent, or the 15 days, and others of you prefer to get a full month's rent up front. And if that's the case, then you would provide for a prorated amount of rent during the second month. And so it's your choice here to fill in the amount that the prorated rent will be, the dollar amount, and then to make a selection in the box there that you're either going to make that payable for the first month of rent or for the second month. Pretty straightforward, pretty similar to what you've already been doing. Let's move next. Security deposit. So the paragraph 5 that's to your right is the security deposit provision in the text of the lease. It's not on the first page. So as you're going through completing this lease on the first page, the security deposit references paragraph 5. So if you are wanting to describe that or discuss that with the resident, that makes it easy for you to know where to refer to it. And one thing that's very clear at this point in this lease form is that the amount you put in the security deposit blank E in box E does not include the animal deposit. So be sure that when you're completing this form, if you have been doing that in the past, to separate out your deposit for the main security deposit and what gets defined as the animal deposit. And it does reflect that you will set forth what the animal deposit will be in the animal addendum. And there are really a couple of reasons for doing this. One is to clarify whether the animal deposit is being made at the time the lease is being executed. And it also can allow for you to attach and complete an animal addendum later if someone gets an animal during the term of the lease rather than at the time you initiate the lease. This will make it easy for you to add on the animal deposit later, and you don't have to figure out how to include it in the initial form as you're completing the lease. Okay, next slide. This paragraph refers to the community policies that it's actually the in the addendum, and it is to give you comfort that there is very extensive description of the items that you are entitled to charge a resident for or against their deposit at the end of the lease term or after there's been a default and move out, etc. It goes into great detail, just as similarly has been done in the lease, but now it's provided in your community policies addendum. So you are going to want to be sure that you utilize the TAA community policies addendum, or if you do your own addendum, that you do something that's very similar or has this kind of coverage, or that you modify this in a way that covers what you desire to be included, as long as you are complying with what Texas law allows for charges against the security deposit. And that's beyond the scope of this program today too. Okay, next slide. The notice of termination or intent to move out is, let's see, this is intended to be the agreed period if there's an agreement to move out early. It is not to be used when you are relying on it if a tenant violates the lease and moves out early. So in this paragraph, most of you out there are using a 60-day period for giving a written notice to terminate or to move out. And this is at the end of the lease term or the lease renewal period, which if it's going on a month-to-month basis, then each renewal period is the new end date of the lease. And so remember to insert the provision here if you want anything different than 30 days. Although I suggest that you, even if you do 30 days, you go ahead and insert the number that you desire to have there. I don't recommend leaving a blank anywhere in the lease at any time, even if the lease may give you the option. I think that provision is there to just give you a little cover in case you did overlook it and fail to fill it in. All right, next. Late fees. This provision is very similar to what's already in the lease. The paragraph 3.3 is in the text of the lease, not on the first page. Please note here that it says if we don't receive your monthly base rent in full, you must pay late fees as outlined in lease details. That's referring back to this box G. That's the late fees that are to be paid according to the lease details. And the box allows you generally an option of choosing two means or methods of charging. One is a percentage amount, or the other is a dollar amount. And so as you're going through this process, you should consider with owner and management what kind of procedure you wish to use, and consider the safe harbor provisions in the Texas Property Code about what charges for late fees are safe under the property code, or whether you may choose to do a different amount and your reasoning for doing so. Just remember that the late fees are based on the monthly base rent and not on all the charges that you have in the lease, such as electric charges, water bills, and things like that. Okay. Next. Finally, for me, my last slide, paragraph or section box H is the return check or rejected payment fee. So you'll note that it does now include a rejected electronic payment as well as the return check fee, because very, very few of us are now getting paper checks, I would say, and everybody's going to the electronic payment or online payment, payment through portal, ECHs, all kinds of things that are other than handing over a paper check. And this is where you fill in the amount that's to be completed there. Next, I'll hand it over to Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. We'll be continuing on our discussion of the lease details box of the first page of the new lease. And the first slide that I have been given to talk about is the reletting charge. Now, this is already in the current or the old lease under paragraph number 10. It's important to remember that this is not a buyout fee, that this is purely estimated liquidated damages that the parties feel will cover the cost of locating, showing the unit to replace the, to find a new tenant to go in there. And as we've always had, it says not to exceed 85%. So this is the reletting charge paragraph that that we've already are pretty familiar with. And again, 7.1, if you go to the lease, talks about the circumstances under which we will be charging this fee for a reletting charge. Moving on to the next slide. This is one of our newer parts of the first page of the lease details. First page of the lease is our optional early lease termination fee. So some of you will use this box, others of you will not. You'll note on the very last line that you have the opportunity to put a 0 if you don't want to use it. So this is being a newer box. We want to pay close attention and carefully follow when and where this is to be used. So this is an opportunity for a resident, if they meet the criteria, and if you, the landlord, want to use this early termination fee, to pay to get out of the lease. But it's limited. And if we look on the right side of the screen, paragraph 7.2 of the lease sets forth the terms and conditions under which this could be used by a landlord and a resident if it's involved. First thing we want to point out is there are 3 blanks that have to be completed on the first page of the lease for this optional section J, the early termination fee. So we have to complete the number of days that a resident has to give us. We have to put the amount of money they have to pay as the first line. The third line is the due date for when that amount has to be paid for us. So we'll have to complete, if we choose to use this section, those 3 areas, those blank lines of that box. Looking over at paragraph 7.2, that gives us more details about the requirements in order to be eligible to use this. The first is the resident has to give us written notice. Additionally, they can't be in default. If the resident's already in default, they're already under eviction, then this is not going to work for them. They can't invoke this if they're already in default. The second requirement is they have to pay the fee, the amount that we put forth in that first blank line in order to use this early buyout. They also have to specify the date under which they'll be leaving, but they have to give the number of days required that we have in that second blank. So the important thing for us to remember on this section, it's optional. You don't have to use it if your company chooses not to. The other thing is it can't be used if the resident's in default. That if we are going to use it, it's limited to the conditions under which the resident's not in default and they've met all the things set forth in paragraph 7.2. Moving on to our next section is the animal violation charge, making it really clear again on the first page of the lease of the initial charge for having an unauthorized animal, and then the second blank line, the daily charge. And as you see in the lease in 12.2, it sets forth the details of when we can charge this. Obviously, animals and unauthorized animals are a huge issue that account for many of the phone calls that a lot of us lawyers get in dealing with residents. And so this certainly will be that area to remind the residents of the fees that will be involved if they don't comply with the community's animal policy provisions. And that again is box K. Moving on to box L, as we continue our discussion of the lease details box on the first page of the new lease, we have an area now, this is new, we have an area now for you to put monthly fixed charges. And I want to re-emphasize that this box L are for monthly fees, monthly reoccurring fees that are not variable, they're fixed. So we provided you some of the most common ones as we look through this box: animal rent, cable and satellite, concierge trash, internet, package service, pest control, storage, stormwater drainage, washer and dryer. Those are the more common ones that many of you will use. Some of them may not be applicable to your community at all, so that you could properly address that. Then you'll notice that you have been provided 4 blank lines for other fees. Again, these are fixed fees that your community may choose. So there's an opportunity there for you to customize the document to appropriately match what your property is using. Let's keep in mind, and these are strong suggestions that we're making, is for these fees to ensure that you have something in writing to where the resident is agreeing to pay these fees. So you want to have an appropriate addenda that goes with these charges that you're setting forth. Many of us attorneys in the industry often see a few words that are put in the special provisions, and we'll talk about that later. It may be abbreviated, but we encourage you to be more formal. So if you're going to charge a fixed fee, have a document associated with that. And here is the paragraph L for you to place that fee in there, give it a title, and then accompany it with the appropriate paperwork. This continues with the theme of this new lease to be transparent, so residents can't say they weren't aware of the fee, they weren't aware of the amount. It's right there on the first page. It's hard for someone to miss these fees and to make those arguments later on. And so this certainly helps to focus in on that and try to minimize someone saying they weren't aware of it. Now, the other paragraph we'll move to the next slide is going to be box M, the other variable charges. So you'll notice that what we've changed from the current lease or the old lease, paragraph 7, where you had checked the box, we've now replaced that with this new M, that we're switching it that you're going to pay for all these things. So we now have, you'll pay separately for the gas, water, wastewater, and we've taken away and replaced that from the old style of checking off those blank boxes of which ones that we might be liable and whatnot. So this helps to be more in line with what most people are already doing. And I think this is a great change to the lease. You've also, as you see, have a blank line now to insert a utility connection charge and a transfer fee, along with paragraph 3.5 of the lease that goes into the detail of setting forth who's paying these fees and who's paying the connection charges. So that's really important there to have that. What's also important to point out is, again, you want to make sure that you have the appropriate addenda that's going to be accompany each of these items, because keep in mind that there are state and federal law that requires those addenda, requires those disclosures set forth when dealing with these utilities. So you want to make sure that you've got those appropriate documents that are attached to your lease going forward that properly sets forth those details. And this slide adds that note that there are a number of forms that go into the various utilities that you'll want to review and attach as appropriate for your property. So this is the variable charges, as opposed to the last slide we talked about were the monthly fixed charges. Moving on to the special provisions box on the next slide. This is, again, to give a property, a community, an opportunity to customize the document as necessary to suit their property and to have a better fit for their needs. This, again, are going to be the special circumstances that are going to pertain to your property. I, again, want to remind you, be careful about adding abbreviations. In contract law, the test is, what does a third party looking at the contract, what conclusions do they make between what the two parties intended that entered into this agreement? And if you've got abbreviations that other people may not understand, a third party, more importantly, a judge, a jury, then that's going to be more difficult for you in the courtroom. So avoid abbreviations. You want to have things that are very clear. You may very well need an addendum for something that some of you are just putting a few abbreviations for, and make it clear that a third party looking at the document truly understands what it is that the two parties are intending by what's in this special provisions. I also want to point out, and this will help you a lot, that the second to last sentence on this document says, this lease is the entire agreement between you and us. So as we all know in our industry, many residents, many people who are responding, or particularly in eviction, small claims court, will make arguments that oral representations were made. And you want to remember to invoke that sentence and use it early and often when having to defend yourself to a false accusation about there being some other type of agreement entered into that's not in the written documentation, by pointing out that this is the agreement. And if it's going to be changed, if it's going to be charged against us and we're expected to be bound by it, then where's our signature to modify the document? So that's certainly important as well. But this gives you more room in this special provisions box that's now enlarged in order to add things that your community would like to have. And with that, I think that concludes my portion of this presentation. Pass it back to you, Sandy.
Thank you, Brian. So I was monitoring some of the questions in the chat as Jerry and Brian were talking, and some of the biggest trend I think I'm seeing is a question about, well, what if I want to include, you know, all the different fees and charges and services into the rent? Can I still do that? And the answer is yes. There's nothing stopping you from having like an all bills paid situation, or even partially a bills paid situation, right? You can include in your base monthly rent everything, some things, or nothing but the rent for the dwelling unit. And so what I think at the outset is you go back to your offices and say, okay, how do we want to portray rent? How do we want to portray any additional services that we might provide, such as pest control, animal rent, and things like that? If you do want to separately list those, then that's fine. This box L gives you that option to do so. And those fixed charges, those ones will be repeated every month throughout the lease term. So you don't have to fill out all of those boxes. You don't, if you have animal rent, but an animal doesn't apply to this particular unit, then you don't fill in animal rent for this particular unit. So you want to make sure that the lease is tailored and customized to that particular unit, that, it makes sense for this contract to only encapsulate the provisions that relate to those parties and to that dwelling unit. And so there are options, there's our abilities to customize, and it should be self-explanatory if you are able to dive in and take a minute to read each of the provisions and some of the caveats that we put in, some of the catch-all provisions, and of course the provision that we have at the very end that Brian just pointed out under special provisions that says if the contract can be changed by a special provision or by an amendment or by an addendum. And you see at the very paragraph 32, the first sentence, the following or attached special provisions or any addenda community policies provided to you are part of this lease and supersede any conflicting provisions in this lease. So if you don't like the way something is portrayed in this lease, then the easiest way to do that would be to take our TAA community policies addendum, that is a red book form that you can easily change and adapt to what you want, put the provision in there that is conflicting with something in the lease, and then that would control. Corey, I want to maybe turn it over to you for a second. Are there any other trends or questions that you've been answering that you might want to hit on? I don't want to call you out, but if you had anything to mention since you've been hot on the press.
Sure. No, Sandy, I think you were pointing out that was far and away the biggest question was, how are we handling a property if we're in all bills paid situation? Do we have to list stuff in box L? And the answer is no. That obviously has sales tax implications that are well beyond the scope of this webinar, but I strongly encourage you to talk to your co-counsel of your preference about that issue. As far as making it clear that you're not charging, I had some questions about box M with the variable charges. And if we're an all bills paid property, if you would be able to put like an NA in there, that's not necessary because it says you'll pay separately as outlined in separate addenda in box N. So if you have no separate addenda, that signals to the resident that you're not charging them for anything else. To the extent that there's other things that you're trying to fill in, or you're looking, you're like, well, where would this go? Or I don't see how I give this information about a parking unit or a parking space or that sort of thing. You're going to deal with that in a separate parking addenda, or for the other stuff that you don't have, you don't find a place in the lease to put in. This is going to be where your community policies is going to shine. And it's a big part of the reason that TAA is pivoting to the use of the community policies, because that's going to allow you to customize the lease and the terms and the provisions to what's going to fit best for your specific circumstance.
Sandy, can I throw in something here?
Please.
One thing that's important, I think people understand, is once this document is completed and the lease is executed, you don't go back and add in provisions to this page 1 as an additional term. Like, for example, you add an animal rent later or an animal deposit or something like that. That needs to be done by a new document and a new addendum, but don't just intermittently here and there go back and fill in various parts of page 1. This is intended to be at the time of lease execution, it's part of the lease at the beginning, and you don't change this page because you change some terms later on.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's something, we hit on in the first webinar in the lease change paragraph. I believe that's 3.6 now in this new form. But, the same thing as what it is under the current lease, you cannot unilaterally change the lease, especially dollar amounts and other important terms. You can make reasonable changes to rules as long as they're distributed to everyone and don't change the dollar amounts. But you cannot, increase the rent or do something like that, without an amendment signed by both parties. And so, you don't want to go back into the lease form after it's been executed and change anything, because that would be an amendment and it would require, signatures from everybody, from both parties. Okay. What other big change or questions came up? I think I had one other one on, let's go to box M, and I want to, go back to box L. I want to highlight the first sentence here in box L. It says, you will pay separately for these items as outlined below and or in separate addenda, special provisions, or an amendment to this lease. So the goal is for you to list those other services that are outside the base monthly rent in this box, so that again you can pick it up and you can say, okay, here are the other types of fees that are associated with this renting this apartment. However, we have a safety zone for you. It's still a contract, and so even if you have an addendum that says you're going to be charged X for some other service that's not listed here, or that even is listed here, you can still, that would still be a valid addendum to the lease and a valid charge, as long as it's allowed by law. So again, the goal is to be transparent and to put all of the dollar amounts on the first page that are going to be those fixed recurring monthly charges. But if you don't do that, again, we have this catch-all provision that should save you. And the other point is that the next webinar that we will be hosting in January 27th, is that we will be focusing a lot on the community policies addendum, our new TAA community policies addendum that we created in conjunction with this new lease product. And we'll be focusing on that, as well as the other commonly used addenda that we see members use time and time again that do relate to, such as, animal rent and cable and washer dryers, pest control, and things like that. So I really encourage you to join in and listen to this 3-part education program. And so hopefully after these 3 parts, you'll feel confident and able to fill out the lease, use the lease, and the entire lease packet. Okay, Brian, did you have some?
If I could just add in and remind people, Sandy, that we're coming up, we're not too far away from our series of Red Book seminars where instructors will be hitting on much of this and going into a lot more detail. So that'll give people a great opportunity, once they've seen the document more, to start asking their instructors more questions and going into more detail.
Yes, we have local associations who have been planning some of those dates. Some of them have yet to be have a date specified, but they're all in the works, and they're all starting, I think early March and going through April. And so be sure to contact us, TAA, or your local association for any questions. And hopefully you can attend some of those Red Book seminars this year, because they're going to be very important for not just all of the changes in the Red Book and flood disclosure and other laws that have come into effect, but this lease, and really diving into the content of the lease, but then also, of course, the legal backdrop behind the lease, and the state and federal laws that come into play, and why we create the lease the way they are to make it compliant. So with that, I will turn it back over to Donna to see if there are any other questions that she has that we would like to answer. But otherwise, I think we can give you back a few minutes for your time.
No, I think we're good. I think they get about 15 minutes of their day back.
Well, that's always good news. Merry Christmas, everybody. Well, I really hope you enjoyed this and this quick breakdown of the lease details box. And we will have the next one coming to you January. We have the one recorded from last month online. This one will be posted very shortly. Please contact us if you have any questions at all. We want to make this rollout as seamless and easy for you as possible. So don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions at all. Thank you to our presenters, and thank you all for joining us. And I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.
Take care, everybody.